Podcast designed to help you fall asleep. On Snoozecast, we read excerpts from public domain works and, occasionally, original stories. Find us on snoozecast.com, follow us on social media, and wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd like to thank our listeners, and we're so glad to help you fall asleep easier. If you enjoy our show, please write us a review on the Apple Podcasts app, even if that isn't how you usually listen to us, because it's the best way to help others find us. Also, share it with a friend. This episode is brought to you by Going in the Right Direction. Tonight, we'll be reading the opening to 1887's A Crystal Age by W.H. Hudson. The book, a pastoral utopian novel, has been called a significant sci-fi milestone and has been noted for its anticipation of the modern ecological mysticism that would evolve a century later. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Chapter 1. I do not quite know how it happened. My recollection of the whole matter ebbing in a somewhat clouded condition. I fancy I had gone somewhere on a botanizing expedition, but whether at home or abroad, I don't know. At all events, I remember that I had taken up the study of plants with a good deal of enthusiasm, and that while hunting for some variety in the mountain, I sat down to rest on the edge of a ravine. Perhaps it was on the ledge of an overhanging rock. Anyhow, if I remember rightly, the ground gave way all about me, precipitating me below. The fall was a very considerable one, probably 30 or 40 feet, or more, and I was rendered unconscious. How long I lay there under the heap of earth and stones carried down in my fall, it is impossible to say. Perhaps a long time, but at last I came to myself and struggled up from the debris like a mole coming to the surface of the earth to feel the genial sunshine on his dim eyeballs. I found myself standing, oddly enough on all fours, in an immense pit created by the overthrow of a gigantic dead tree with a girth of about 30 or 40 feet. The tree itself had rolled down to the bottom of the ravine, but the pit in which it had left the huge stumps of severed roots was, I found, situated in a gentle slope at the top of the bank. How, then, I could have fallen, seemingly so far from no height at all, puzzled me greatly. It looked as if the solid earth had been indulging in some curious transformation, pranks during those moments or minutes of insensibility. Another singular circumstance was that I had a great mass of small, fibrous rootlets tightly woven about my whole person, so that I was like a colossal basket worm in its case, or a big man-shaped bottle covered with wicker work. It appeared as if the roots had grown round me. Luckily, they were quite sapless, and brittle. And without bothering my brains too much about the matter, I set to work to rid myself of them. After stripping the woody covering off, I found that my tourist suit of rough Scotch homespun had not suffered much harm, although the cloth exuded a damp, moldy smell. Also, that my thick-soled climbing boots had assumed a cracked, rusty appearance, as if I had been engaged in some brick field operations. While my felt hat was in such a discolored and battered condition that I felt almost ashamed to put it on my head. My watch was gone. Perhaps I had not been wearing it. But my pocketbook, in which I had my money, was safe in my breast pocket. Glad and grateful at having escaped with unbroken bones from such a dangerous accident, I set out walking along the edge of the ravine, which soon broadened to a valley running between two steep hills. And then, seeing water at the bottom and feeling very dry, I ran down the slope to get a drink. Lying flat on my chest to slake my thirst animal fashion, I was amazed at the reflection the water gave back of my face. It was skin and hair, thickly encrusted with clay and rootlets. Having taken a long drink, I threw off my clothes to have a bath, and after splashing about for half an hour, managed to rid my skin of its accumulations of dirt. While drying in the wind, I shook the loose sand and clay from my garments, then dressed, and, feeling greatly refreshed, proceeded on my walk. For an hour or so, I followed the valley in its many windings, but failing to see any dwelling place, I ascended a hill to get a view of the surrounding country. The prospect, which disclosed itself when I had got a couple of 100 feet above the surrounding level, appeared unfamiliar. The hills among which I had been wandering were now behind me. Before me spread a wide rolling country, beyond which rose a mountain range resembling in the distance blue, banked-up clouds with summits and peaks of pearly whiteness. Looking on this scene, I could hardly refrain from shouting with joy. So glad did the sunlit expanse of earth and the pure, exhilarating mountain breeze make me feel. The sun was late summer, that was plain to see. The ground was moist, as if from recent showers, and the earth everywhere had the intense, living greenness with which it reclothes itself when the greater heats are over. But the foliage of the woods was already beginning to be touched here and there with the yellow and russet hues of decay. A more tranquil and soul-satisfying scene could not be imagined. The dear old Mother Earth was looking her very best, while the shifting golden sunlight, the mysterious haze in the distance, and the glint of a wide stream not very far off seemed to spiritualize her happy autumn fields and bring them into a closer kinship with the blue, overarching sky. There was one large house or mansion in sight, but no town, nor even hamlet, and not one solitary spire. In vain, I scanned the horizon, waiting impatiently to see the distant puff of white steam from some passing engine. This troubled me not a little, for I had no idea that I had drifted so far from civilization in my search for specimens, or whatever it was that brought me to this pretty, primitive wilderness. Not quite a wilderness, however, for there, within a short hour's walk of the hill, stood the one great stone mansion, close to the river I had mentioned. There were also horses and cows in sight, and a number of scattered sheep were grazing on the hillside beneath me. Strange to relate, I met with a little misadventure on account of the sheep, an animal which one is accustomed to regard as of a timid and inoffensive nature. When I set out at a brisk pace to walk to the house I have spoken of, in order to make some inquiries there, a few of the sheep that happened to be near began to bleat loudly, as if alarmed, and by they came hurrying after me, apparently in a great state of excitement. I did not mind them much, but presently a pair of horses, attracted by their bleatings, also seemed struck at my appearance, and came at a swift gallop to within 20 yards of me. They were magnificent-looking brutes, evidently a pair of well-groomed carriage horses for their coats, which were of a fine bronze color, sparkled wonderfully in the sunshine. In other respects, they were very unlike carriage animals, for they had tails reaching to the ground, like funeral horses, and immense black leonine manes, which gave them a strikingly bold and somewhat formidable appearance. For some moments, they stood with heads erect, gazing fixedly at me, and then, simultaneously, delivered a snort of defiance or astonishment, so loud and sudden that it startled me like the report of a gun. This tremendous equine blast brought yet another enemy on the field in the shape of a huge milk-white bull with long horns, a very noble kind of animal, but one which I always prefer to admire from behind a hedge or at a distance through a field glass. Fortunately, his wrathful mutterings gave me timely notice of his approach, and without waiting to discover his intentions, I incontinently fled down the slope to the refuge of a grove or belt of trees clothing the lower portion of the hillside. Spent and panting from my run, I embraced a big tree, and turning to face the foe, found that I had not been followed. Sheep, horses, and bull were all grouped together just where I had left them, apparently holding a consultation or comparing notes. The trees where I had sought shelter were old and grew here and there, singly or in scattered groups. It was a pretty wilderness of mingled tree, shrub, and flower. I was surprised to find here some very large and ancient-looking fig trees, and numbers of wasps and flies were busy feeding on a few overripe figs on the higher branches. Honeybees also roamed about everywhere, extracting sweets from the autumn bloom and filling the sunny glades with a soft, monotonous murmur of sound. Walking on full of happy thoughts and a keen sense of the sweetness of life pervading me, I presently noticed that a multitude of small birds were gathering about me, flitting through the trees overhead and the bushes on either hand, but always keeping near me, apparently as much excited at my presence as if I had been a gigantic owl or some such unnatural monster. Their increasing numbers, an incessant exciting chirping and chattering at first served to amuse, but in the end began to irritate me. I observed, too, that the alarm was spreading, and that larger birds, usually shy of men, pigeons, jays, and magpies, I fancied they were, now began to make their appearance. Could it be, thought I, with some concern, that I had wandered into some uninhabited wilderness to cause so great a commotion among the little feathered? I very soon dismissed this as an idle thought, for one does not find houses, domestic animals, and fruit trees in desert places. No, it was simply the inherent cantankerous of little birds which caused them to annoy me. Looking about on the ground for something to throw at them, I found in the grass a freshly fallen walnut, and breaking the shell, I quickly ate the contents. Never had anything tasted so pleasant to me before. But it had a curious effect on me, for whereas before eating it I had not felt hungry, I now seemed to be famishing, and began excitedly searching for more nuts. They were lying everywhere in the greatest abundance, for without knowing it, I had been walking through a grove composed in large part of old walnut trees. Nut after nut was picked up and eagerly devoured, and I must have eaten 4 or 5 dozen before my ravenous appetite was thoroughly appeased. During this feast, I had paid no attention to the birds, but when my hunger was over, I began to again feel annoyed at their trivial persecutions, and so continued to gather the fallen nuts to throw at them. It amused and piqued me at the same time to see how wide of the mark my missiles went. I could hardly have hit a haystack at a distance of 10 yards. After half an hour's vigorous practice, my right hand began to recover its lost cunning, and I was at last greatly delighted when of my nuts went hissing like a bullet through the leaves, not further than a yard from the wren, or whatever the little beggar was I had aimed at. Their impertinences did not like this at all. They began to find out that I was a rather dangerous person to meddle with. Their ranks were broken. They became demoralized and scattered in all directions, and I was finally left master of the field. "Dolt that I am," I suddenly exclaimed, "to be fooling away my time when the nearest railway station or hotel is perhaps 20 miles away." I hurried on, but when I got to the end of the grove, on the green sward near some laurel and juniper bushes, I came on an excavation apparently just made. The loose earth, which had been dug out, looking quite fresh and moist. The hole or fosse was narrow, about 5 feet deep and 7 feet long, and looked, I imagined, curiously like a grave. A few yards away was a pile of dry brushwood, and some sticks bound together with ropes of straw, all apparently freshly cut from the neighboring bushes. As I stood there, wondering what these things meant, I happened to glance away in the direction of the house where I intended to call, which was not now visible owing to an intervening grove of tall trees, and was surprised to discover a troop of about 15 persons advancing along the valley in my direction. Before them marched a tall, white-bearded old man. Next came 8 men, bearing a platform on their shoulders with some heavy burden resting upon it. And behind these followed the others. I began to think that they were actually carrying a corpse with the intention of giving it a burial in that very pit beside which I was standing. And although it looked most unlike a funeral, for no person in the procession wore black, the thought strengthened to a conviction when I became able to distinguish a recumbent, human-like form in a shroud-like covering on the platform. It seemed altogether a very unusual proceeding, and made me feel extremely uncomfortable, so much so that I considered it prudent to step back behind the bushes, where I could watch the doings of the processionists without being observed. Led by the old man, who carried, suspended by thin chains, a large bronze censer, or brazier rather, which sent out a thin continuous wreath of smoke. They came straight on to the pit, and after depositing their burden on the grass, remained standing for some minutes, apparently to rest after their walk, all conversing together, but in subdued tones, so that I could not catch their words. Although standing within 15 yards of the grave, the uncoffined corpse, which seemed that of a full-grown man, was covered with a white cloth and rested on a thick straw mat provided with handles along the sides. On these things, however, I bestowed but a hasty glance, so profoundly absorbed had I become in watching the group of living human beings before me, for they were certainly utterly unlike any fellow creatures I had ever encountered before. The old man was tall and spare, and from his snowy white majestic beard I took him to be about 70 years old. But he was straight as an arrow, and his free movements and elastic tread were those of a much younger man. His head was adorned with a dark red skull cap, and he wore a robe covering the whole body and reaching to the ankles, of a deep yellow or rhubarb color, but his long wide sleeves under his robe were dark red, embroidered with yellow flowers. The other men had no covering on their heads, and their luxuriant hair, worn to the shoulders, was, in most cases, very dark. Their garments were also made in a different fashion, and consisted of a kilt-like dress which came halfway to the knee, a pale yellow shirt fitting tight to the skin, and over it a loose, sleeveless vest. The entire legs were cased in stockings, curious in pattern and color. The women wore garments resembling those of the men, but the tight-fitting sleeves reached only halfway to the elbow, the rest of the arm being bare, and the outer garment was all in one piece, resembling a long, sleeveless jacket reaching below the hips. The color of their dresses varied, but in most cases different shades of blue and subdued yellow predominated. In all, the stockings showed deeper and richer shades of color than the other garments, and in their curiously segmented appearance, and in the harmonious arrangement of the tints, they seemed to represent the skins of pythons and other beautiful serpents. All wore low shoes of an orange-brown color, fitting closely so as to display the shape of the foot. From the moment of first seeing them, I had no doubt about the tall old leader of the procession, his shining white beard being as conspicuous at a distance as a shield or a banner. But looking at the others, I was at first puzzled to know whether the party was composed of men or women, or of both. So much did they resemble each other in height, and in their smooth faces, and in the length of their hair. On a closer inspection, I noticed the difference of dress. Also, the men were sterner. They had faces, at all events less mild and soft in expression than the women, and also a slight, perceptible down on the cheeks and upper lip. After a first hasty survey of the group in general, I had eyes for only one person in it, a fine, graceful girl, and the youngest. This is sort of weird paragraph here.